I remember the way the string lights hung like delicate constellations over the polished tables in that private lounge on Pine Street, the tiny bulbs humming softly above my head. I'd chosen every detail with care. The amber glow cast the room in a warm hush, while a curated jazz playlist drifted from hidden speakers, the notes of Miles Davis and Ella Fitzgerald weaving through the air like a slow embrace. I'd even selected the cake myself. A simple vanilla bourbon confection, its surface glossy and unassuming, decorated only with a light swirl of buttercream and a single silver candle. I thought back to the first time I'd learned what it meant to plan something for someone else, how good it felt to watch another person's face when they realized you'd done it for them. I thought this evening would feel like that, like love, properly served. The invitations had gone out weeks ago, and I'd tracked every RSVP obsessively. My wife, Mira, had texted that she'd be there, her enthusiasm evident in the string of exclamation points she used. Her sister, Taryn, had asked about the dress code, and her parents, Colleen and Braden, had inquired about the parking situation. I pinged my old friends, Marcus, from college, who'd bailed me out of a jam more than once, Jamila, whose laugh I could hear in my head, even Arthur and Paige, whose friendship had survived cross-country moves and years of silence. Each message felt like another step closer to what should have been a perfect night. I imagined their laughter, the clink of glasses, the way Myra's eyes would light up when I led her to the centerpiece cake, the moment she'd press that silver candle into the buttercream and whisper, "Happy birthday," before I even opened my mouth. I arrived early, wearing a navy blazer over a crisp linen shirt, my hair still damp from a quick stop at the gym. I'd slipped the keys to the lounge door into my pocket and walked through the empty space, running my fingertips across the banquette's leather backrest, straightening the chairs with a precision born of habit. I placed my phone on a nearby ledge and double-checked the guest list one last time. It was 7:45 p.m., and everything smelled faintly of lemon and polish. All that remained was to wait and watch as the people I loved most walked through the door. By 8 o'clock, I realized something was off. No familiar footsteps echoed down the corridor. No laughter spilled from the hallway. My phone stayed silent, the subtle buzz of inaction humming in my hand. I ran through every possible excuse. Maybe the traffic had been worse than they predicted. Maybe someone had called an emergency. Maybe Mira forgot her phone downstairs. I texted again, heading to the lounge. "See you soon." No response. I glanced at the cake, its smooth surface reflecting the soft lights above, and felt a gnawing knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. At 8:15, I tried calling Mira, just one ring before it went to voicemail. I left a gentle message. "Hey, love, I'm here. Just let me know if you're running late." I imagined her voice on the other end of the line, apologetic and warm, promising she'd be there in 10, maybe 15 minutes. I pictured the opening strains of My Funny Valentine as I slid the cake out on a silver platter, the way her hand would find mine across the table. But the voicemail remained unreturned, and the jazz track on the playlist tucked itself under a muted hush. When the clock ticked past 8:30, hope lodged in my throat like a splinter. I dialed Taryn next, my fingers trembling slightly as I pressed her number. Again, straight to voicemail. I tried Marcus, Jamila, Arthur, Paige. Each call followed by the same digital emptiness. My breath felt shallow, my vision narrowing to the cake and the empty chairs around it. The string lights seemed to hover, mocking in their quiet persistence. I closed my eyes and let a slow exhale drift from my lips, telling myself maybe there was still time for a grand entrance, that a chorus of apologies awaited me at the door. But no one came. By 8:45, I was alone, surrounded by evidence of the celebration that would never arrive. The cake, pristine and untouched. The tables, set with polished glassware. The playlist, looping its soft refrain. I sank onto the banquette, my back straight but my shoulders heavy, and stared at the empty space where laughter should have gathered. I thought of the birthday breakfast of my childhood, of my mother's bright smile and the way she sang "Happy Birthday" off-key. I thought of every milestone I'd shared with people who had chosen to stand beside me. I thought of my 40th birthday adrift in an empty lounge, and the weight of that number pressed against my chest. When the final track faded, the emptiness stretched out before me like an invitation to grief. I stood up, brushing a stray crumb of reflection icing from my jacket sleeve, and walked to the cake. My hand hovered above the candle, trembling. I let my finger trace a single line across its creamy surface, watching as it left a thin furrow. My heart clenched. Not because I had turned 40, but because I had expected to matter to those who claimed they did. I looked around once more before whispering into the quiet, "Happy birthday, Garrett." And then I slipped out the door, leaving the cake behind, uncut and unclaimed. A week had passed since the jazz-infused ghost of my 40th birthday lingered in that empty lounge, and I tried to keep myself busy. Work deadlines, morning runs, the hum of life ticking forward. But every sound and routine felt off-kilter. I noticed, in every quiet moment, the absence of Myra's laughter, the hollow echo of my own footsteps through rooms that once felt shared. Then, in the late afternoon sunlight, my phone buzzed with a message that felt like a fresh incision. It was from Mira. No greeting, no apology, not even a sigh of regret, just 4 words and a demand. $2, $800 per person for Dad's birthday in Savannah. Venmo me today. My first reaction was a slow blink, as though the text had accidentally landed in someone else's inbox. In my mind's eye, I pictured a lavish coastal resort in Georgia, palm trees swaying, silk linens on whitewashed porches, beachside cocktails with umbrellas. The promise of a birthday celebration for her father, Braden, was nothing new. He'd always taken grand gestures seriously, but the tone of that message was a knife wrapped in dexterity. It assumed I would pay, no questions asked, as though the person who'd been betrayed and abandoned overnight remained an ATM for their convenience. I stared at the screen and reread the words, $2,800 per person. That price tag was precise, punitive almost, as if each dollar was a measure of revenge for my absence at my own milestone. A lump pressed against my throat, and I tightened my fingers around the phone until it creaked. Venmo me today. It felt like a command. A summation of every unspoken insult in our marriage. I closed my eyes and remembered the way Braden had smiled at my 40th party invitation, how he'd patted my shoulder and told me birthdays were a chance to celebrate every year you've survived. Mira had nodded enthusiastically then. Now she was reduced to an emissary of financial demand, a reminder that, in her mind, money equated love. I scrolled through our joint account on my phone, confirming the balance. Enough to cover this weekend's tab, but not by much once bills and obligations were met. And I realized, with a surge both maddening and liberating, that I no longer wanted anything to do with this financial Audubon they'd built at my expense. I didn't type back indignantly. I didn't launch a barrage of questions. Instead, with deliberate slowness, I opened Venmo and sent Mira exactly $1, accompanied by a message that felt as quiet and contained as a pistol shot congrats. It was a gesture so minimalist that it cut deeper than any tirade. I acknowledged her father's birthday, but I refused to be complicit in their extravagance. That single dollar thudded into her account with a terse click, an echo of everything I'd wanted to say but held back. I refused to bankroll your self-centered celebrations. I refused to stand for being treated like a bank vault. I refused to pretend that anything about our life together still resembled partnership. With that done, I powered down my laptop and walked through the apartment, my footsteps echoing on scarred hardwood floors. I paused at the master bedroom's doorway, where my side of the bed lay undisturbed, a neatly arranged set of pillows and a wrinkle-free comforter. The sight of it filled me with an odd sense of relief. I went to my nightstand and picked up the box of spare keys I'd stashed there for emergencies. Old habits die hard, and carried them to the front door. That afternoon, I changed every lock on the apartment: bedroom, front door, sliding glass, even the rarely used utility closet. I labeled the new keys with a permanent marker, Garrett's only. The act felt primal, like shedding skin I'd been forced to wear for too long. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply did what needed doing. I reclaimed the spaces they'd taken for granted. That evening, for the first time in 12 years of marriage, I lay alone in bed with the weight of that empty mattress pressing against me. I stared at the ceiling, the gentle hum of streetlights drifting through the blackout curtains. I fought the urge to replay that terse message, $2, $800 per person for Dad's birthday, and the image of her fingers tapping out those words. But I also felt something new, a flicker of strength. I had refused her demand. I had taken back my home. I had drawn the boundaries she'd trampled without hesitation. And in that quiet rebellion, I felt the beginnings of freedom. The next morning, I woke early, poured a strong black coffee, and sat on the balcony overlooking the courtyard. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a reminder that life continued beyond my domestic upheaval. I loaded the spreadsheet application on my tablet and began listing every gift and payment I'd made over the years. Taryn's divorce attorney fees, Colleen's dental surgeries, Braden's physical therapy sessions. Numbers that had sailed out of my account under the guise of generosity or marital obligation. I assigned dates, Venmo IDs, and bank statements to each entry, calculating a running total that climbed toward $173,200. The sum of what I'd given, unasked, undocumented, assumed. I clenched my jaw as each figure resolved on the screen. It wasn't bitterness driving me so much as clarity. I owed them nothing. More accurately, they owed me everything. I finished the audit by mid-afternoon, then saved the file and printed it. I sat at the dining table and surrounded myself with stacks of paper, invoices, bank statements, screenshots. I slid the neat spreadsheet on top and typed a simple email to Julian Ross, the attorney who'd once negotiated the acquisition of my small consulting business. I wrote, "Please review attached and advise next steps." I want it all back. My finger hovered above the send button for a moment, an exhale poised between regret and resolve. Then I clicked. The message sailed into the uncertain world of legal recourse, a declaration that this chapter of my life would end with justice, not goodwill. As evening approached, I sat in silence, the hum of my own thoughts louder than any playlist. My phone remained curiously quiet. No calls from Mira, no frantic messages at odd hours. The world beyond my front door felt simultaneously vast and contained. I realized that the lecture I'd been peddled for so long about love measured in dollars, loyalty repaid with interest, was a lie I no longer believed. I had sent $1 for a birthday. I had documented a six-figure ledger of misplaced generosity. And I had reclaimed my home, my boundaries, and, most crucially, my self-respect. The price of her extravagance was more than money. It was the cost of my own worth. And now, at last, I understood that some debts should never be forgiven. I turned off the table lamp, left the papers where they lay, and lay down on my reclaimed side of the bed. Tomorrow, I'd let the lawyer speak. But tonight, I listened to the steady rhythm of my own breathing, a testament to the truth I'd finally recognized. Some values are priceless, and mine was one of them. The day I received the bank notification, my stomach knotted like a twisted phone cord, and my hands grew cold as I stared at my laptop screen. It wasn't a gentle ping, it was a blaring alarm. Suspicious login attempt from a new device. My heart thudded against my ribs as if it were trying to break free. I clicked on the alert, squinting at the details, an IP address from halfway across town, a timestamp I didn't recognize. I ran my finger over the trackpad, feeling the fine tremor of panic before I quelled it into a calm that felt more dangerous than the fear itself. I opened my banking app, scrolling through recent activity until I reached the joint checking account Mira and I had shared since the second year of our marriage. That same account had paid for Taryn's divorce attorney, Colleen's root canal work, and Braden's week of physical therapy after he slipped on our stairs last winter. I'd always justified it as part of being a husband and son-in-law supporting family in need. But now I knew that account was a wound, and someone was trying to stick a knife in it. There it was, a withdrawal request, pending approval, for a sum so precise it felt personal. My throat dried as I realized someone had logged in and tried to drain the account. I scrolled up and down the transaction history, searching for clues. There was no other new login, no other strange transfer. Just this single, brazen attempt. It occurred to me that I'd been foolish to leave that account open as an emergency fund. It had served every emergency but mine. The betrayal stung deeper than any forgotten birthday or unpaid loan. I shut the laptop gently, as though I feared it might shatter. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, letting the cool liquid steady my racing pulse. My mind circled back to the moment I changed the locks on every door in the apartment. Front, bedroom, sliding glass, even the utility closet. I remembered the click of each new lock tumbling into place, the label I wrote on each key, Garrett's only, and the surge of autonomy I'd felt. That had been my first act of defiance. And this felt like the next, defending my finances as fiercely as I defended my home. I went back to the computer and clicked Freeze Account. It was an automated process, but it felt deeply satisfying, like setting a piton into the stone of my life. I tapped the confirmation button and watched as the status changed from active to frozen. I allowed myself a small, hollow victory smile before I drafted an email to the bank's fraud team. I kept my message concise. I did not initiate this withdrawal. Please investigate immediately and cancel any pending transactions. I hit send, then sat back, my shoulders heavy with relief and dread in equal measure. Next, I picked up my phone and dialed Julian Ross, the corporate lawyer I kept on retainer from years ago when I sold my small consulting firm. Our relationship had always been strictly professional. No small talk about birthdays or anniversaries. So when his familiar voice answered, I almost envied his calm. "Julian," I said, keeping my tone level, "I need your help. There's been an attempted unauthorized withdrawal from my joint account, and I want to escalate this legally. What are my options?" He paused, then asked for details, jotting down the transaction amount and the fact that it came from the account I'd kept open for emergencies. He promised to review bank policies and advise on next steps. It was businesslike, precise, the language of contracts and courtrooms, and I felt the stirrings of power return to my chest. I didn't call Mira. I didn't confront her mother or sister about the attempted heist. Instead, I sat in the early evening light, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside the window, and let the adrenaline ebb into quiet resolve. My mind flickered through memories of our early days, Mira laughing over takeout cartons in our tiny first apartment, her head thrown back as she twirled noodles with chopsticks. I'd thought then that we were building something together, a partnership of equals. Now I recognized that she and everyone on her side had seen me as a resource, a source of funds to be tapped whenever convenience demanded. The next morning, I arrived at the bank in person. The lobby smelled of polished terrazzo and stale coffee, and the soft murmur of other customers drifted around me. I approached the fraud desk and handed the teller my ID, explaining the situation with the same calm I'd used on the phone. She nodded sympathetically and printed out a form for me to sign. As I filled in my details, I felt eyes on me. The curious glance of the banker who knew my name, the flicker of interest from the security guard by the door. I signed the paperwork and watched the teller scan it into the system, freezing the contested withdrawal and flagging my account for extra monitoring. Before I left, I asked for copies of the bank's terms regarding joint accounts and fraudulent transactions. The teller handed me a small stack of brochures. I tucked them under my arm like a shield. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk, the sun warming my face, and allowed myself a moment to acknowledge how far I'd come in a week, from an abandoned 40th birthday to the edge of financial sabotage, and now to a man taking control of his own narrative. I returned home with those brochures in hand and sat at the dining table surrounded by paperwork once more. I spread out the bank's policies next to the spreadsheet I'd prepared detailing every cent of support I'd poured into my in-laws' lifestyle. I highlighted clauses about account holder rights, unauthorized transactions, and joint ownership responsibilities. The air in the room felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I took a deep breath and drafted another email, this one to a representative at the bank's legal department. Attaching the scanned policies, my signed fraud report, and a concise request for written confirmation that my account was secure and that any further attempts would trigger immediate legal action. With that sent, I leaned back and exhaled, aware of how alien it felt to be in this role, the vigilant protector of my own assets. For years, I'd been the generous spouse, the accommodating son-in-law. Now I was a man setting boundaries, marking territory, and refusing to be plundered. I realized that this battle wasn't really about money. It was about respect. Respect I'd given freely until there was nothing left, and respect I was now demanding back. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in months, the monotony of my breathing a quiet victory. The locks held, the banks blurred, and I had drawn a line in the sand. No more automatic withdrawals, no more silent acquiescence. Tomorrow, I would check in with Julian. I would explore the possibility of demanding restitution for the attempted theft. But tonight, I simply lay in bed, eyes closed, and let the darkness cradle me, knowing that I was, at last, defending myself as diligently as I had once defended everyone else. Friday night arrived with the sort of stillness that hinted at rain, even though the sky remained stubbornly clear. I was reclining on my couch, feet propped up on the coffee table, leafing through emails from that morning. An awkward combination of meeting reminders and the bank's latest fraud notice when the doorbell cut through the quiet like a sudden high note. My heart skipped, conditioned over the past week to expect disturbances. Texts from Mira demanding money, late-night phone calls I refused to answer, threats whispered behind lawyerly envelopes. I glanced at the clock. 8:03 p.m. unusual timing. I set my laptop aside and walked to the peephole. Two figures stood on the porch, one, an older man in a navy uniform that suggested late career law enforcement. The other, a younger officer in a crisply pressed shirt, shifting uneasily from one foot to the other. I blinked. A missing person report? My pulse quickened. I pressed the intercom button on the door frame. Yes, I said, voice steady. Mr. Morrow, the older officer began, and even from behind the glass I heard a tightness in his tone, as though he wasn't quite sure where this belonged in the hierarchy of police work. I'm Detective Harper, and this is Officer Klein. We received a report that you may be at risk of self-harm or missing. Your wife, he hesitated, as though that detail might compromise the official nature of the visit, filed a welfare check. We just wanted to make sure you're all right. I studied his face, saw the concern mingled with professional courtesy, and realized I had to choose my words carefully. This was no longer about locked doors or frozen bank accounts. This was an intrusion into the most intimate territory of all, my mind. I'm fine, I said, stepping back so the window slid open on its smooth track. There's no cause for concern. The older detective stiffened, and I quickly added, in fact, I'm very much here. I work from home. See this laptop? I've been logged into Zoom since this afternoon, and I just got groceries at the market. Here's the timestamp on my receipt. I withdrew my phone, unlocked it, and pulled up the grocery app. I showed him the timestamped entry, 5:37 p.m., Clark's Market. I paused, letting the data sink in. The younger officer raised an eyebrow at his partner. I sensed a silent conversation unfolding between them. This was domestic territory, but the presence of official badges meant protocol had its own stubborn demands. Detective Harper leaned forward to read the receipt over my shoulder, then nodded slowly. That should satisfy the report, he said, closing a small notebook. We don't usually handle domestic disputes, but we have orders to respond to any missing person alerts. He gave me a tilt of his head. Might I suggest, if you feel your safety is at risk, you consider a protective order? A restraining order, perhaps? The younger officer offered a half-smile, as though they recognized my defiance might be a cry for help in disguise. I shook my head, surprised by the genuine care beneath their official protocol. I appreciate the concern, I said. But I'm not in danger from anyone except the low quality of the coffee at the corner shop. My attempt at levity landed between us, awkward and perhaps unnecessary, but it served its purpose, humanizing the encounter. Detective Harper slipped the notebook back into his pocket. Well, sir, if anything changes, if someone else files another report, just call 911. Otherwise, we're all set. He gave a curt nod and stepped back, the younger officer following suit. I closed the window and let out a breath. My chest had been tight, conditioned to brace for the blows of betrayal. Now, in the sudden emptiness of a vacant porch, I realized how alone I felt. I turned away from the door and leaned against it, the cool wood a grounding presence. The police had seen my receipts, my Zoom logs, my gym check-ins. They had given me a glimpse of normalcy through their windows. But normalcy felt like an echo of a life I once had, before financial scams, before abandoned birthdays, before cold demands for thousands of dollars. I pressed my palm against the painted surface and thought of the locks I'd changed. Each one had been a statement. This is mine, only mine. And yet here was proof that even my absence, my refusal to answer texts, my refusal to acquiesce, could be weaponized against me. Missing, or at risk, were labels thrown at me by people who saw only the silence of an unanswered iPhone. It made me realize how thin the line was between being cared for and being controlled. I walked into the bedroom and picked up the small box of keys I'd labeled the week before. Front door, bedroom, utility room. I flipped through them absently and located the backup emergency key, one I'd hidden behind the mirror, just in case. I used to think of it as a convenience. Now it symbolized the old version of myself who trusted too easily. I closed the box and slid it onto the top shelf of my closet, where I'd stored the documents I'd printed. The spreadsheet of $173,200 in unreciprocated support, the contracts, the bank's policy brochures. Each paper had been a brick in the wall I built around myself. Now I felt something behind that wall, not the brittle solitude I'd expected, but a quiet core of determination that had nothing to do with fear. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling fan's slow rotation, its shadow tracing lazy spirals on the white paint. My reflection caught in the window pane across the room. Unshaven jawline, lines forming at the corners of my eyes, shoulders squared with a resolve I only half recognized. The officers had suggested a restraining order, and while the idea of legal protection once felt like another admission of helplessness, it now felt like a tool. A way to mark the boundary between my sanity and their entitlement. I reached for my laptop, opened a new document, and typed temporary restraining order at the top. Below that, I listed the reasons: attempted financial theft, false missing person report, harassment. I paused, inhaled deeply, and wrote one more phrase: I do not consent. The next morning, I emailed the draft to Julian, attaching the police report number and the witness statement from the bank teller. I asked him to file the order by the end of the day. Then I called the courthouse clerk to confirm filing procedures, making sure I understood the timeline and paperwork. By early afternoon, I had an appointment with a magistrate. It felt almost absurd, me, in my own home, chasing legal shields against the very people I'd once welcomed at the dinner table. But when I hung up, I experienced a rare sensation: release. Not because I feared for my safety, though perhaps I did, in a broader sense, but because I had reclaimed the narrative. I was no longer the helpless husband. I was the architect of my own protection. That evening, when I closed the laptop, the porch was dark and silent. No police cars, no anxious footsteps, just the steady hum of city life beyond my walls. I opened the front door and stepped onto the threshold, the air cool against my skin. I paused and looked out at the street, remembering the way the service lights of the lounge still glowed, unclaimed, at Pine Street. I closed my eyes, envisioning the locks snapping home. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet I'd fought so hard to preserve, I understood what boundaries truly meant. Not walls to keep people out, but spaces to keep myself intact. I stepped back inside, closed the door, and locked it. Once, twice, 3 times. Affirming that I was here, very much present, and finally free to define my own safety. Saturday morning arrived with a bleary softness, the kind that settles in when sleep is both deep and fractured. I'd spent the night tossing between relief and dread, the memory of 2 officers standing on my porch swirling in my mind. By the time sunlight spilled through the curtains, I reached for my phone and found no new messages, a small victory that tasted oddly like suspense. I made coffee, black and bitter, and settled at the kitchen island to review the agenda of tasks, send documents to Julian, draft a restraining order motion, follow up with the bank. My world had narrowed to lines of text and legal procedures, and yet, as I sipped the coffee, I felt a fleeting ache for the simple predictability of routine domestic life. I just opened the spreadsheet delineating every cent of unreciprocated support when the doorbell rang again. My heart lurched, and I glanced at the clock. 10:17 a.m. No mail deliveries at this hour. Who could it be? I approached the window and peered through the blinds. Outside, on the welcome mat, stood Mira flanked by Taryn and Colleen. Myra's posture was rigid, her arms folded across her chest, eyes fixed on the door as though it owed her an explanation. Taryn hovered behind her sister, a predatory energy in her pace, one foot tapping impatiently, while Colleen pressed a tissue to her mouth, eyes glistening with tears. My chest twisted, a familiar churn of anticipation and defiance. I pressed the intercom button. "What do you want?" My voice sounded threadbare, as though I'd forgotten how to speak to my own family. Myra's response was swift, clipped. "Open the door, Garrett. You're blowing this way out of proportion." Her words landed flat, like spilled coffee on a crisp shirt. I depended on that door, those locks, to keep more than just physical threats out. I'd bolted away demands for money, expectations, emotional manipulation. It was the last line of defense in a relationship that had been unraveling for months. I studied them through the peephole. Myra's jaw was tight, as though she bit down on each syllable. Taryn's shoulders were squared in defiance, and Colleen's tears caught the morning light. I considered my next move, felt the itch behind my eyes to yell, to break something. But I knew that any eruption would only play into their narrative, that I was unreasonable, unstable, withholding love. Instead, I clicked the intercom again. "I'm not inviting you in," I said, lowering my voice. "State your business." Myra's eyes narrowed. "Business? I came for my husband, not some corporate board meeting. Do you know what you've done?" You forgot my birthday, then tried to freeze our accounts, and now you refuse to talk. I snorted. You forgot mine. You charged Dad's trip to my account. You tried a stealth withdrawal. I've only done one thing. I've stopped being your lifeline. Taryn piped up, her words spilling fast like a broken faucet. You're acting like this is a business partnership. This is family. You don't get to keep score. The mention of family stung more than any legal maneuver. I remembered our wedding day, the promises we made, the way our families had applauded as we exchanged rings. Now those same voices screamed betrayal across the threshold, as though the vows, and my sacrifices, meant nothing. You don't get to redefine family by spending my money, I said quietly. My tone carried the weight of someone who had rehearsed this speech in front of the mirror for days, infusing each word with carefully measured resolve. Family doesn't operate on invoices and demands. Family supports each other without sending Venmo requests. Colleen pressed the tissue harder against her face, her voice trembling. We thought you loved us. You abandoned us when we needed you. The tremor in her voice jarred me, her genuine hurt contrasting with the opportunistic cruelty of others. I felt a sudden pang of regret for her, the mother whose dental work and therapy bills I'd once covered without question. But regret wasn't enough to bind me to the old cycle. Myra's lips curled in anger. You're withholding everything. Money, affection, communication. If you love me, you'll light up your phone right now and say you're sorry. I pressed my forehead against the cold wood of the door. I could taste the anger on my tongue like acid, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'm not apologizing for setting boundaries, I said. Boundaries aren't crimes. They're the only way I can keep myself intact. Taryn's voice rose, a crescendo of indignation. You're the victim now? How convenient. Not convenient, I shot back. Necessary. I glanced at a small camera perched above the frame, my doorbell cam, and realized this confrontation was being recorded. I almost laughed, our drama, preserved for posterity in high definition. My reflection shimmered in the lens, a face marked by sleepless nights and an accumulation of betrayals. Myra's expression cracked for a moment, vulnerability flickering behind her anger. But she swallowed it and returned to the script of outrage. Then you'd better be prepared to cut us out completely. She turned away, and Taryn followed, Colleen's sobs trailing behind them as they retreated. The doorbell clicked twice more, an echo of unfinished business, before the sound faded into the hush of the hallway. I exhaled, my breath catching in my chest. For a moment, the house felt too quiet, as though it held its breath alongside me. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for fading footsteps, until only the hum of my own blood drumming in my ears remained. I stepped back and switched off the intercom. Alone in the living room, I sank onto the sofa, my heart beating a slow tattoo against my ribs. I thought of every dollar I'd spent, every barrier I'd erected, every moment I sacrificed to keep them afloat. I thought of the plywood I'd installed on the basement windows to keep out cold and intruders. Now a metaphor for my hardened defenses. I ran my fingers through my hair, tugging lightly as if to loosen the knots of stress. Then I stood and walked through the house, touching the surfaces. The kitchen counter where coffee had once been shared, the bathroom sink where laughter had once echoed, the bedside table where I'd left my journal. Each touch felt like reclaiming space, marking territory not with aggression but with ownership of my own life. I closed the living room curtains against the afternoon glare and took a deep breath. In the silence that settled, I felt the weight of what I'd done, not out of malice, but out of necessity. I'd chosen myself over their demands. I'd drawn a line they crossed at their peril. And though the sting of abandonment still throbbed, I recognized something new beneath it, a quiet resolve that no longer needed their approval to exist. I sat on the sofa, folded my hands in my lap, and let the calm wash over me, knowing that this was just the beginning of a journey in which I was finally the protagonist of my own story. A week after I sent the spreadsheet and legal notice, a crisp envelope arrived in the mail, bearing the crest of the county recorder's office. I tore it open with the same reverence I'd once reserved for birthday cards and love letters, only to find a refinance notice for the beach house I had co-signed for years earlier. The paper was clinical: notice of application to modify mortgage terms, listing the property address, loan number, and the names of all parties with a legal interest. My name stared back at me, a silent witness to the fact that I'd forgotten I was still on the title. Their names, Myra's, Taryn's, even Colleen's, appeared in neat typeface, But I was the only one who hadn't consented to this transaction. That realization hit like an ice-cold wave. They were trying to flip the house without me. In the morning light, I sat at the kitchen table, riffling through the refinance paperwork as if it were evidence from a crime scene. The refinance terms were favorable to the borrowers. Lower interest rate, extended term, a cash-out provision that would have given them an additional $50,000 if the application had gone through. I remember the day I'd signed the original mortgage. I had agreed to help Braden retire early, believing in the promise of family and mutual support. I'd envisioned weekends of sandcastles and barbecue smoke drifting over the porch, not this betrayal disguised as financial planning. I placed the papers down and rubbed my forehead, the crease between my brows deepening. The beach house had been a symbol of shared sacrifice. Now it was a weapon aimed at my financial stability. I dialed Julian's number before I even stood from the table. His voice, always calm, greeted me like a familiar refrain. "Julian, they filed a refinance application without my consent. We need to stop it." I outlined the details, holding the phone between shoulder and ear as I paced the apartment. He asked for the notice's date, the loan number, and confirmation that no one had notified me prior to filing. Each answer I provided felt like adding another brick to the fortress I was building against them. Julian promised to file an injunction to freeze any title changes immediately, and he reminded me that, legally, all named parties had to sign off on the refinance. I hung up with a sense of grim satisfaction. Next, I emailed my accountant, Karen, requesting an urgent 6-year audit of every transaction involving that property. I asked her to detail mortgage payments, insurance premiums, maintenance expenses, and any cash calls I'd covered. The total had hovered in my mind, a vague sense of numbers floating near 100,000, but I needed precision. Within hours, I had a spreadsheet open on my laptop, populated with line items and date stamps. Braden's HOA fees, Taryn's roof repairs, Colleen's plumbing emergency, even a weekend getaway weekend they'd billed to my card as family retreat. The sum kept climbing until I leaned back and read the bottom line, $173,200 in undocumented, unreciprocated support. I stared at that figure as though it were a confession written in ink. That afternoon, I drafted an email to the trio, Mira, Taryn, and Colleen, with the subject line, itemized accounting and refinance objection. In the body, I wrote plainly, "Please find attached the detailed audit of all payments I have made on behalf of the beach house since 2020. This totals $173,200. I hereby object to any refinance or transfer of title not executed with my explicit written consent. If you wish to pursue the refinance, you must first buy me out at fair market value, with the balance payable within 14 days of closing." I attached the spreadsheet as a PDF and CC'd Julian on the email. Sending it felt like dropping a gauntlet on their side of the court. I clicked send, then closed my eyes, waiting for the fallout. It arrived within 48 hours. Myra's reply was a single line, "You're impossible." Taryn's was more elaborate. "Family isn't a ledger, Garrett. We expected you to understand that." Colleen's was the saddest. "I thought we were a family. I didn't know money would come between us." Their words lit a fire of frustration inside me. I had expected anger, confusion, perhaps even guilt, but the refusal to acknowledge the sums I'd covered for them felt like salt in a raw wound. Their entitlement was staggering. The way they treated my past generosity like an open-ended credit line, never once imagining reciprocity. I closed my laptop firmly, the click of the lid sounding like a verdict. That evening, I drove to the beach house. It was a short trip down winding coastal roads, the salty air drifting through my open window. As I turned onto the driveway, I saw Myra's car parked near the garage, dusty and empty. The paint on the siding had dulled in the setting sun, a reminder that time moved on even when memories froze in place. I walked up to the front door, keys jangling in my pocket, and unlocked it with purpose. Inside, I found signs of hasty departure. A half-empty bottle of white wine on the kitchen counter, 2 espresso cups on the coffee table, an open laptop showing a paused video call. It struck me then that they'd expected me to accommodate their whims without question, and when I finally asserted my rights, they fled like startled birds. I returned to the city apartment that night, feeling a mix of triumph and melancholy. I had successfully blocked the refinance, forced them to acknowledge my stake. I had taken control of my finances. Yet the house, the symbol of family unity, felt hollow. as though our shared dreams had been etched on sand and washed away by the tide. I walked into the living room, sat in my worn leather chair, and let my gaze drift over the city lights. My reflection shimmered in the window. A man who had once given without hesitation, now fiercely guarding every asset and boundary. In the coming days, Julian sent the court order freezing the title changes and advising that any attempted refinance would invite sanctions. The beach house would remain locked in its current ownership structure until the dispute resolved, or until someone took the step of buying me out. I thought of the spreadsheet again, the stark numbers that quantified years of generosity. I realized I wasn't angry at the house itself, but at the idea that my good faith had been weaponized against me. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of lessons learned, that partnership requires balance, and that boundaries are not built out of malice but out of the need for self-preservation. Later that week, I packed a bag, returned to the beach house alone, and spent the night on the guest bed. I sat on the deck at dawn, watching the waves break against the shore, and felt the first true sense of solitude I'd experienced in months. The sunrise painted the sky in hues of pink and gold, and I drew in a deep breath, tasting the salt and relief. The house still stood, its windows reflecting the morning light, but now it felt like open territory rather than shared territory, an opportunity for me to reclaim its meaning on my own terms. As the sun climbed higher, I knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I understood what victory looked like. Not simply possession, but the peace that comes from knowing you're no longer someone's unpaid guarantor, but a person whose worth cannot be refinanced without consent. The morning after I sent the spreadsheet and watched the refinance notice stall, my inbox erupted like a shaken soda can finally uncorked. Myra's curt reply, "You're impossible," felt like a drop of acid. Taryn's scolding email, "Family isn't a ledger, Garrett. We expected you to understand," that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. And Colleen's tearful note, "I thought we were a family. I didn't know money would come between us," cut deeper than any legal brief. I stared at the screen, my chest heavy with a mix of vindication and sorrow. This was the echo chamber I'd feared, every plea and accusation ricocheting back at me, reminding me that confrontation often breeds chaos. I brewed coffee strong enough to cut glass and poured it into my favorite mug, the one chipped at the rim from an accidental drop years ago. The steam curled into the air as I considered my next move. I could wade into their emotional storm, offering apologies I didn't feel, promises I would break, fumbling for reconciliation. Or I could stay the course, let my lawyer handle the legal quagmire, maintain my boundaries, and let the chips fall where they may. Despite the ache in my heart, I chose the latter. My life had become a ledger, yes, but it was time for theirs to reflect the cost of boundaries. By midday, Julian had filed the injunction freezing the beach house's title. The court's clerk emailed me a confirmation. All title actions on Property X are hereby stayed until further order. I saved the PDF as victory, though the feeling was too complex for such a simple label. It wasn't triumph I savored, but agency. I wasn't at their mercy any longer. I wasn't an open vault to be plundered by familial expectation. I was a person with rights, and I intended to exercise every single one. That afternoon, I stepped outside for a run, a ritual I'd neglected under the weight of betrayal. The city's sidewalks hummed with life, parents chasing toddlers, baristas calling out orders, a stray dog chasing an ice cream truck's retreating melody. My pace quickened as I approached the park, the dappled sunlight dancing on the path. With each stride, I felt tension drain from my shoulders, replaced by a fierce calm. My legs moved automatically, carrying me past the duck pond, across the footbridge where couples strolled hand in hand, and into a grove of oaks where the air smelled of moss and possibility. I paused to catch my breath, looked up at the canopy above, and realized that life outside my front door continued. Beautiful and different, and demanding nothing of me but presence. Back at the apartment, I sorted through the avalanche of voicemails, texts, and emails I'd been ignoring. Among them were sympathetic messages from old friends, Marcus, who remembered our fraternity days and offered to take me out for beers, Jamila, who sent a link to a weekend art exhibit, even Paige, who confessed that she, too, had been ghosted by family over money. Their kindness reminded me that alliances extend beyond blood ties. Family, I decided, was not strictly genetic. It was also the constellation of people who chose to stand with you when the storm hit. I drafted replies, brief, honest acknowledgments of my situation, gratitude for their support, and a promise to accept their invitations once I'd cleared this mess. That evening, I sat down to dinner alone. A grilled salmon fillet, roasted Brussels sprouts, a glass of Riesling. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of how long it had been since I'd enjoyed a meal without distraction or obligation. My phone buzzed once with a message from Julian. Judge signed the injunction. They have 14 days to respond or face contempt. I replied with a simple thank you, then set the phone aside. For the first time in months, I felt the contours of my own life returning. I wasn't just reacting to their demands, I was living my own story again. Later, I opened the journal I kept by my bedside, a leather-bound volume filled with scribbled reflections on birthdays betrayed, attempted withdrawals, locked doors, and the spreadsheet that quantified my generosity. I flipped to a blank page and wrote, "I will not apologize for standing up for myself." Beneath it, I sketched a rough outline of the next steps. Follow up with the bank fraud department, schedule a hearing date with Julian, explore mediation options if they chose to negotiate. Then I wrote something unexpected. I deserve happiness too. On day 10 of the injunction, Mira called. I almost didn't answer, certain that her voice would carry more demands. But I picked up. "Garrett, can we talk?" she said, her voice tentative, fragile. I glanced at my closed laptop, then back at the phone. "Sure," I replied. "What do you want?" There was a pause, as though she was gathering her thoughts. I'm sorry. I didn't realize how badly I hurt you." Her words fell unevenly, awkward in their sincerity, but I heard them. It was the first apology I'd received in weeks. I closed my eyes, remembering the empty lounge, the cake uncut, the locks I'd changed, the spreadsheet of debts recast as demands for restitution. "I'm tired," I said finally, voice low. "I need time to heal." She responded with a simple, "I understand." The space between us crackled with tension and relief. It wasn't a resolution, far from it. But it felt like a crack in the dam. Perhaps, I thought, boundaries can open the door to something new, even if that something was uneasy. That night, I walked to the second-hand shop down the block, the one with the carved wooden sign in the window, "Freedom isn't escaping people. It's choosing yourself." I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the grain of the wood carving like a pulse. I realized that I'd been choosing myself all along. Each lock changed, each dollar I'd reclaimed, each legal document filed. Those choices had created this moment of tenuous possibility. I turned away from the shop and walked home under the streetlights, my shadow stretching behind me, solid and singular. The echo chamber had exploded around me, but in the fragments I found my voice. I was still here, still whole, and ready to speak the next line of my story. They panicked first. Within days of the injunction, I watched the listing go live. Beach house for quick sale, below market value. The photos under fluorescent light showed the same porch where I'd watched sunrises alone, now empty and echoing. It felt like a declaration of surrender and spite all at once, an admission that they needed my money and an attempt to strip the asset bare before I could enforce my terms. I sat at my dining table, eyes fixed on the laptop screen as I watched the price drop by $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 in quick succession. It was a fire sale, one they hoped would corner me, buy us out at the price we set, or watch this sunset slip through your fingers. I closed the laptop and ran a hand over my face, tasting frustration like salt. Then I opened the spreadsheet again and adjusted the buyout line. Instead of $173,200, it would match whatever their final asking price was. If they insisted on a rock-bottom figure, they would still owe me the difference. The math was simple. I would not lose because they peddled my own generosity at cut-rate value. As word of the listing spread through social circles, friends who owned real estate agents, colleagues broken-hearted over family drama, I received messages offering to broker quick deals and let me in on an off-market sale. I forwarded each offer to Julian with a note. "They're desperate. Let them sweat." I didn't need middlemen. I needed clarity. Every inquiry and knock at the door reminded me how valuable that house was and how dearly I intended to be paid. Meanwhile, the family's desperation reached absurd levels. Taryn liquidated her mother's jewelry box, pearls, gold chains, a vintage sapphire ring that must have cost a small fortune. I watched private sale posts on collectible platforms. Estate jewelry, all must go. Then Braden's beloved vintage Mustang, restored lovingly after he crashed it into my stairs, showed up on a collector's site. Even the espresso machine Mira used once a month, a gleaming stainless steel contraption she'd bragged about, went on Craigslist. I told Julian to track the link. Each sold item were bullets fired at my own wallet, a grim testament to how they'd spent my money. Payments began trickling in. $10,000 wired 2 days after the listing, another $6,000 a week later. I watched my account balance increment, the digital ledger recording each deposit like a slow drumbeat of justice. I let the payments come without fanfare, pouring coffee in the mornings and glancing at the online statements with satisfaction that felt neither vengeful nor joyous. It was simply right. Restitution for every unauthorized withdrawal, every refinancing attempt, every emotional ambush. When the final $5,200 hit my account, sealing the total of $21,200 they'd scraped together, I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. I could almost hear the click of a vault door shutting behind me. I wasn't chasing more. I was content that they'd paid exactly what I demanded, and not a penny more. That evening, I stood at the window of my living room, looking out at the city lights and the quiet street below. The apartment felt expansive, unfettered by past obligations. I realized the beach house was gone, sold to some new owner, strangers who would bring fresh memories to those sun-washed rooms, but I felt no nostalgia. The real asset I'd reclaimed wasn't real estate, but my autonomy. They had tried to flip my kindness into currency at fire sale prices. Instead, they confirmed its true worth. A week later, I received a final group message from Mira, Taryn, and Colleen. Transaction completed. We'll redirect future communications through Julian. No apologies, no lingering appeals to family ties, just a curt acknowledgement of business closed. I replied with a single word, understood. Then I turned off my phone. I celebrated quietly that night, a glass of wine, the faint hum of a jazz record I hadn't played since before the locks, and the knowledge that I would sleep without fear of unwelcome intrusions, financial or otherwise. My heart settled into a steady rhythm, unthreatened and untroubled. The fire sale had burned down their leverage, and in its ashes I found a tranquility I never expected. I woke the next morning and walked past the secondhand shop's carved wooden sign. Freedom isn't escaping people. It's choosing yourself. I smiled, because I knew now that freedom was precisely that, a testament written not in deeds or dollars, but in the resolute decision to honor one's own worth. 3 months after the last wire transfer settled in my account, I joined the Friday night social at my coworker Jenna's insistence. I hadn't planned to attend, convinced that any gathering would only remind me how isolating it felt to reclaim my life. Yet Jenna was insistent. Come blow off steam. It's just bowling. So I showed up at Golden Pins Alley, its neon lights flickering above rows of lanes and the smell of stale pizza clinging to the air. The cacophony of laughter, pin clatters, and distant disco music felt oddly comforting, like stepping into someone else's story for a while. My coworkers greeted me with enthusiastic high fives and cheery nods. They piled plastic shoe rentals into my hands and led me to Lane 7, where colorful bowling balls waited like alien eggs. I chose a green one with perfect finger holes and rolled my first frame with surprising grace, a strike. Cheers erupted, and I felt the warm rush of belonging. 4-2 frames, I reveled in that. Giggles at gutter balls, celebratory fist bumps when someone knocked down 8 pins, and the blur of camaraderie that passed for normal in a weekend night. Then I glanced to my left, toward Lane 8, and froze. There he was, Braden Morrow, my father-in-law, limping slightly as he adjusted the bulky rental shoes 2 sizes too large. He'd always been a larger-than-life figure in our family, boisterous, opinionated, a man who measured devotion in dollar signs. Now he looked small and out of place, his vintage polo shirt hanging loosely, a strained expression on his face as he lined up a shot. I hadn't expected to see him here, let alone alone. My breath caught in my chest, and for a moment the lane's harsh lights felt like a spotlight on every painful memory between us. Jenna noticed my change in posture and nudged me. Hey, you okay? I nodded, but she didn't press. Instead, she grabbed her ball and rolled her shot, sending pins tumbling. I turned back to Braden. He had just released his ball, and it sailed down the lane, wobbling dangerously before missing the pins entirely. He exhaled heavily and looked up, scanning the crowd as though searching for someone. Our eyes met. Mine widened. His flickered with surprise, then something softer, regret, perhaps. He took a slow step toward me, but a group of teenagers careened around him, laughing, and he stopped, awkward and vulnerable. I left my lane and approached him, expecting tension. Instead, I felt a rush of empathy, so strong it surprised me. "Braden," I said quietly, and he started, as though he'd forgotten anyone else existed outside his cramped world of demands. He turned fully and gave me an uncertain nod. The alley's lights danced on his watery eyes. He shifted his weight, the squeak of his rental shoes punctuating the silence between us. "I'm not here to ask for money," he said at last, voice low enough that only I could hear. I glanced back at Jenna, who gave me an apologetic smile and stayed by my lane. "I came because I owe you an apology. For everything." He paused, swallowing. "I was jealous of your independence. I thought if I controlled everything, I could hold on to my own worth." His admission landed between us like a fragile egg. I exhaled, nudged by relief. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "But honesty happens now." I met his gaze, searching for sincerity. "I don't forgive easily, but I recognize change." He nodded, tears glinting. "I was wrong," he whispered. Across the lanes, my coworkers cheered a spare conversion, but that noise receded. I and Braden stood in the collision of past betrayal and possible redemption. He extended his hand. I hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it. His grip was warm, slightly unsteady, but equal. No deference, no authority. Just a shared acknowledgement that boundaries had been crossed and perhaps, now, could be rebuilt. We stepped back to our respective lanes. He rolled another ball, this time knocking down 5 pins. I laughed softly and clapped. "Better," I said. He managed a small grin. The pins lay scattered, proof that even imperfect attempts can yield progress. All around us, the alley's neon haze and rattle of pins continued, indifferent to our personal reconciliation. And in that moment, I realized closure need not be flawless. It simply needed sincerity and a willingness to roll the ball again. That night, I walked home under a sky so clear the stars almost felt within reach. My apartment building's facade loomed ahead, a quiet contrast to the neon tumble of Golden Pins Alley. The keys jingled in my pocket, but I paused on the sidewalk, the cool air filling my lungs with a sense of finality. No new Venmo requests, no unread texts demanding action. Just silence. It was a silence I had long feared, a void I once would have filled with explanations, apologies, assurances. But now I welcomed it as proof that the chapter I'd lived was truly closed. I turned down the block toward the second-hand shop I'd passed countless times during this upheaval. Its window was darkened for the night, but a single spotlight illuminated a carved wooden sign leaning against a coat rack. "Freedom isn't escaping people. It's choosing yourself." I read the words softly, savoring each syllable like a benediction. Freedom wasn't an escape hatch. It was the deliberate decision to honor one's own boundaries, to value one's own worth above the insisting voices that demanded leverage. I remembered the laughter that should have greeted me at 40, the cake that never got cut, the locks I'd changed on doors that once stood open. I thought of the spreadsheets, the legal filings, the injunctions and wire transfers. Tools I'd wielded not out of malice, but necessity. And I understood, in a way I never had before, that self-respect was the most precious asset I possessed. It couldn't be withdrawn by a Venmo request, diluted by refinancing, or hijacked by false welfare checks. It was mine to guard, mine to nurture. A gentle breeze stirred leaves at my feet as I continued home. My phone lay silent in my pocket. I had no desire to break the quiet. Instead, I unlocked the front door and slipped inside, feeling the familiar click of the locks behind me like a final seal. The apartment greeted me with the scent of polished wood and the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. I set my keys on the console and headed to the living room, where the leather chair waited under the lamp's warm glow. I poured a glass of whiskey, neat, and raised it to the empty room, a private toast to my own survival. The amber liquid caught the light as I swirled it, thinking of every boundary set, every demand refused, every dollar reclaimed. This was not the life I'd imagined when I first walked down the aisle, naive and hopeful. It was richer, in its own way, a life I'd earned through confrontation, through clarity, through choosing myself. I sank into the chair and let the silence settle around me like a soft blanket. Outside, the city's pulse thrummed through the walls, indifferent yet reassuring. There was no grand finale, no curtain call, just this moment of stillness, unbroken by conflict or compromise. I closed my eyes and exhaled, feeling the tension of the past months unwind. Tomorrow, I would fill the day with work, with friends, perhaps even with laughter. But tonight, I savored the simple truth blinking in the quiet. I was here, wholly myself, and finally free.